I mentioned that we're going to be talking about methods, and more specifically, we're going to talk about objects and message passing. So let's take a look at an object. We've seen lots of examples, it turns out, because everything in Ruby is an object. A string, among other things, is an object. And what we can do is we can call methods on it using the dot notation. In this case, I'm going to call the length method on the string. This is also called passing the length message to the string, or to the string object. It's also called sending the length message to the object. So no matter what you call it, the answer is 6 because foobar has length 6. Let's look at another example. We can send the empty question mark method. I sometimes anthropomorphize these variables or these objects and say we're asking foobar whether it's empty or not, and the answer is false. But the empty string is empty. And we can also write it like this, with single quotes. This kind of method here, with a question mark at the end, is called a Boolean method because it returns either true or false. And these kinds of methods are especially useful for control flow. So let's give an example of that. Assign a string to or assign a foobar to this variable s for string. And I'm going to say if s is empty, then do one thing. I'm going to return string is empty. Else, I want to say the string is non-empty. And as you might have expected, it printed out, or rather it returned the value, the string is non-empty. Notice there's no put s here. This is actually returning this value. It's not printing it. It's a subtle distinction, but it would be returning nil and printing this to the screen if we'd done put s. If we want to include more than one clause, we can use Ruby's else if. Say if s is nil, if s.nil question mark. Of course it's not. Else if, see the middle e disappears for some reason. s.empty. Else if s.include question mark. Checks for a substring inclusion. And then we could put an else here if we wanted to, or we can just end it. Let's look at some other examples of what Booleans can do. And in this context, I wanted to find a couple more variables to make them short. So x is the string foo, y is the empty string. And now I want to print out both strings are empty if they're both empty. Notice that we can put the if statement at the end here. This is actually fairly unusual. Most languages don't allow you to do this, but Ruby does. So if x.empty question mark, oops, and y is empty, y.empty question mark. So think about what this is going to do. Well, x is definitely not empty, y is empty, so this is false and this is true. So false and true is false. So we want both of them to be true, but only one of them is true, so this returns nil. And in particular, it doesn't put this out to the screen. Let's change this up here. One of the strings is empty if x is empty or y is empty. So or is double pipe. Lots of languages have the same syntax, so if you've programmed much at all, you've probably seen this. Here, printed out, one of the strings is empty. Wow, look at that triple click. It selects the whole screen. One other particularly important operator is the not operator. Actually, I can do a single quote. Why not? So put x is not empty if, oops, actually the tilde in some contexts does mean not, but not here. It means we need to use bang. The exclamation point is where it is bang x.empty. And because x isn't empty, it prints out x is not empty. I mentioned before that everything in Ruby is an object. That includes nothing. Nil is an object, which means that we can pass messages to it. This is a really important method. It's toS. This converts the object to a string. In this case, it's the empty string. So nil itself is not empty. You can see that it says no method error, undefined method empty for nil. And nil is its own class. It's the nil class. We'll talk about that a little more, this idea of a class in this lesson. So we can't ask if nil is empty, but we can ask if nil.toS is empty. And calling multiple methods like this is called method chaining. There's a special Boolean method for testing if an object is nil that's quite important. You might be able to guess what it is. It's nil question mark. And of course, foo is not, the empty string is not. So you might guess the only thing that's nil is nil. We saw before this if at the end of the statement. Here it is, put x is not empty if not x.empty, or if bang x.empty. This if not construction can be converted to the equivalent unless. All Ruby objects have a Boolean value that you can extract by doing not. So you can do not x.empty. That's true because x isn't empty, but x.empty itself is false. So if you negate it twice, not false is true, not true is false. Now in this context, there's no reason you would do bang bang x.empty question mark, because this thing, this empty question mark, already returns a Boolean value. But this is nice for testing things like a string. Gave me a warning here, but that's not important. What is important is that it return true, which is to say that the string foo is true in a Boolean context. Now there's something here that's going to surprise a lot of people if you haven't used Ruby before. There are in fact only two things in Ruby that are false. There's false, of course. It evaluates to itself. Bang bang false is false. Nil is also false. So in a Boolean context, nil is false. But everything else is true. In particular, something like the number 0, which is false in a lot of languages, is true in Ruby, as is the empty string and pretty much any other empty object. I say pretty much. Everything else. Every empty anything. Empty hashes, empty arrays, empty anythings. They're all true because the only things that are false in Ruby are nil and false itself.